This video is mostly for family, those that are interested in maybe World War One and some different things. So recently, when I went to France, one of the things we did was travel to the Oise-Aisne Cemetery. So Oise-Aisne is an American cemetery, approximately maybe 60 to 70 miles sort of northeast of Paris, France. And as I make this video, I'll probably mispronounce several things, but I'm going to do my best. So the reason why we went to that cemetery is my great uncle, so my grandpa's brother, Bryan Fellows, was killed in the World War One during the Second Battle of the Marne. What I wanted to do is take a few seconds and talk about that, mainly like kind of document some family history for those that are interested. And I'm no way an expert on World War One or anything like that, but I did find some interesting facts and some different things. So first of all, let's look at a couple of maps here. Well, actually, let's look at a couple of documents here. Okay, this document came from the cemetery. The gentleman that was there was super helpful. The American cemeteries have like a superintendent who's an American, and it seems like most time they are retired military who take these jobs for a certain period of time. They live in whatever country the American cemetery is located, and this particular cemetery is in between superintendents, so there was nobody there to talk to except for this gentleman from France who was super helpful, spoke really good English, and I don't think I missed anything that I could have gained from somebody else. This guy has been there for years and years and years, knows the cemetery like the back of his hand, and not only just a history buff, but very passionate about his job and keeping the place immaculate. So there's a team of, I don't know, like 10 people. They told me it seemed like it was like 10 or 12 people, and the place is immaculate and clean. No complaints about anything that they showed us or did. So what this is a passenger list of the soldiers that went to World War One. Down here says Bryan Fellows. His emergency contact would be my great-grandfather, Edward Sterling Fellows. They actually lived on Fellows Street in Round Grove, Illinois. It looks like he left September 18th, 1917 from New York City. So that would have been approximately 10 months before he was killed. Another interesting fact, let me come down here, click on this image. Up here, the cause of death, died of wounds received in action on 7/18/1918. And he was first buried near this town here, Magdeburg. I don't know how to pronounce that. So he originally was buried there. He was buried the day after he died from his wounds, which was the next day. About a year later, he was disinterred and reburied in Oise, had the emergency contact and everything on here. On the next page, about 3 years later, 1922, he was moved to, once again, to the Oise-Aisne American Cemetery. So these words are pronounced Oise and almost like the letter N, Oise-Aisne American Cemetery. And this is where he was buried. Come down here, so some other images. So this plaque is in the reception area when you first go in. One of the famous people who was also killed during the war was Joyce Kilmer, who was a poet. He was killed by a German sniper. So he was a poet and quite famous actually, and he's also buried in that cemetery. When you enter the cemetery is on two sides of the road. So this right here is a highway that goes through, and this picture is from like the reception area, and then across the street you actually enter the cemetery. So we went in. They weren't expecting us. We didn't call ahead of time. But if you look at these crosses, you can't really see anything written on them. And if they know you're coming, what they actually do is they wet some sand. They mix some water with sand so that it packs, fill in these the letterings, because they're engraved, so that when you take pictures you can actually read it. So if you look at this one, it says Robert Purdy, I believe. You can't hardly read it. So they weren't expecting us, but even though they weren't expecting us, he went and got that material, walked us out, showed us where the grave site was. I could have probably found it based on the numbering, and I knew where to go, but he knew exactly where to go. They put the French flag. They packed the sand in there and then wipe off the extra so you can see it better. I'll just go through some pictures here. So these are just some random pictures of, that was the opposite side of the cemetery. This picture kind of shows like how precise they're installed in different rows and some different things. This picture is like a memorial. It tells some different things. I made some videos that explains what these columns all represent, and there's these logos up here that represents the different divisions or platoons of the different military, different countries that were in these battles where these soldiers are buried. A few other pictures. This is from kind of the center of the cemetery. There's like this roundabout thing. So this is the reception area. Look in the opposite direction of this. Those are the pictures. Let's look at a couple maps. Let's look at this town here, Oise-Aisne. So here's where the American Cemetery is, and then here's that town, Oise-Aisne. Let's go back up here. So the cemetery is in this area over here. So there's that Oise-Aisne, and here's where the cemetery is at. Let's look at a couple things here. So I said originally he was killed and buried in a town called Montgobert, if I'm pronouncing that right. So this is over here, and there's that Oise-Aisne. Let's go back and look at this map again. There's Oise-Aisne, and that town is not on this map, but it's in this area over here. The division or the military unit he was with, this red line is the front, where the Germans were up here, and American and French and some other countries were all around here, and they were trying to push the Germans back. And here's the Marne River down here. My great uncle, he was with the American platoon or division that was coming from the west pushing east, and so in this area right here is where he was killed on that day. Where he was killed, he was buried. The French person at that cemetery, he explained that they typically, during the war, they were buried very near where they died. And oftentimes they were buried not in like the city cemetery, but usually in land that was joined to the city cemetery. So if there was a city cemetery, a certain square, the land immediately next to it, typically probably a farmer's field, is where they buried the soldiers that were killed. Sometimes it'd be one person buried, or like half a dozen, or 30. It just depended how many were killed in that area. That's where he was buried first. So he was buried there 7/19, and then the following summer he was moved to this other cemetery. So let's see where that's at. So once again, he was buried in here. Here's this Oise-Aisne. And then the next place he was buried was Oise, if I pronounce that right. So Oise is just a little bit farther east, right in this area here. I don't know if there was originally going to be an American cemetery there or not. The document makes it look like it says American Cemetery. Let's bring that up again. So it says grave 57, section H, whatever. I think that means American Cemetery, Oise-Aisne. So that was here. Then he was moved to the Oise-Aisne American Cemetery. Let's bring that map up. So there's Oise-Aisne, and then the Oise-Aisne American Cemetery is here. And I'll zoom into it. You can actually see how it's laid out. In the picture I showed you, that roundabout area was here. Over here, that building is the reception area. So if I put on the satellite view and zoom in, you can see these crosses all align perfectly. My great uncle is buried approximately right in this area in here. In June of 2023, they actually buried another soldier here that they found. And I'm like, how did they find 100 years later? Why are they finding soldiers now? Like, how did that happen? What he said was soldiers were buried next to the city cemeteries when they died, and then they went and they moved their bodies. They dug them up and moved them. Well, they weren't always documented. If the town folks themselves buried the person, they might have put a wood cross or a marker. A year later, when they went and they moved the bodies, if they weren't documented, obviously they might not know exactly where they were buried. So anyhow, I don't know the exact details where, but in one of these surrounding towns, in a local cemetery, they were actually expanding the cemetery, and they bought the land next to the cemetery to expand the cemetery. And a local undertaker was digging a grave, or the cemetery was digging a grave for someone who recently died, found a body. They discovered it was an American, and they contacted the Americans, and they went and they took the body and everything, and they knew it was American because they were buried with their dog tags and their uniforms, and by their uniform and everything they could tell it was an American. But apparently they did DNA testing, and there wasn't enough DNA to identify who exactly it was. So, but they knew it was American, World War I, and everything else. So that person was buried just in June in the Oise-Aisne Cemetery here. There's a list of names of soldiers who were killed in that area, and their bodies were never identified or found. But there's also a whole bunch of unknown soldiers buried, so that either their dog tags or whatever were lost. They just know they were Americans, so they're buried. So there's two things. There's a list of soldiers, and then there's several graves that are from unknown soldiers. So the person they found and buried there, he very well could be documented, but they just don't know who's who. A bunch of unknown graves. So that's a summary of what we discovered about our great uncle Bryan Fellows being buried in France. Hope you found this educational and not too boring. Like I said before, I'm kind of doing this to document some family history. So it may be boring to others, but for others it might not be. Okay, I'm at the Oise-Aisne. By looking at the spelling, you would never guess it's pronounced that way unless you understand French, which I don't. So the Oise-Aisne American Cemetery, and we're about 60-70 miles from Paris. We rented a car and we drove here. So we've already been up here. The gentleman who greeted us, super helpful. Not only is he super helpful, he's a history buff, and you can tell he loves his job. So there's 6,000 American soldiers buried here. There's a few that are not American. He said there was like one French, one from Sweden, a Russian or two, some French, did I say that are buried here. But so Bryan Fellows was my grandpa's brother. So he was 19 years old, drafted for World War I, obviously. And where I'm standing was one of the battlegrounds. So he was in the 2nd Division. And the 2nd Division, they were, I don't know how far miles away, like maybe 5 to 10 miles away on the Marne River. So he was killed early in the Battle of the Marne, July 18th, 1918. So a little bit, I'm gonna walk up. There's a map, shows where the 2nd Division was. So it was like, yeah, like I said, like the very beginning of the battle, he was killed. So the people that are buried here, it just how it was explained to me. The farther, so the the visitor area is way over there, and as they most of the graves were in temporary graves where they died. They buried them like on the battlefields where they died, and then later they started to bring them here once this was designated as an American cemetery, which apparently actually started during the war. So there's already people being buried here during the war. In fact, he said the first soldier was just across the road in a field at a farm where he was buried, and he was the first one buried. So the way it was explained to me, the closer to the road, the graves closer to the road were the temporary cemeteries were closest to this cemetery. So as they moved them, apparently they started with the closest cemeteries and brought buried the soldiers based on proximity. So as you can see, like, I'm almost to the end. So the Marne River, later we'll look at this map, you could tell that the Marne, the 2nd Division, was far away from here in relationship to like this battle. So I asked if the soldiers from the 2nd Division were like grouped together and buried together, and he said no, that so actually this is Infantry 2nd Division. So some of them were, so apparently they were brought here like in groups. So it depends on how many were killed in certain areas. He said it might be like 10 to 15 were buried like in small little temporary cemeteries during the time. But so it looks like the 2nd Division included people from other parts of the country. So let's go up here and check out this other part up here. Okay, so you have this memorial thing here, and it looks like it was built in 1929, which it looks like practically brand new, to be honest. But these slabs are granite or marble or something. I didn't mention the crosses are made of marble. It's a certain kind of marble that is used for World War I crosses, and the ones that are used for World War II soldiers is different. So these columns represent each of the different I don't know if I'm saying this right, the divisions that fought around here in this battle. And the second one here is the 2nd Division. Has an Indian head, if you can see it. I don't know if I'm pointing right because it's super bright and I can't tell. So that was the 2nd Division, and then each one was different. And the one over here with the helmet was an African American division that was issued French equipment. So the helmet was like a French helmet, and so that represents that division. And he went through each one, and to be honest, I didn't catch them all because he was doing a great job explaining everything, but I don't have a good memory. So this is a chapel, but in this chapel is a map, and so where I'm at right now is by this town here, and this is the cemetery where we're at. And down here, this is the Marne River, and this is the 2nd Division. So the 2nd Division came up against this line and started to battle the Germans. And this is where as far as the 2nd Division went. And so my great uncle was killed somewhere in this area here, and but was buried in a temporary cemetery in this area here. And then eventually was brought up here. So I don't know, I'll have to like look at Google Maps, see how far that was. But so the 2nd Division was replaced by the 26th or whatever, and then they kept pushing this way, and then the 42nd, and then the 4th Division all the way up until they pushed the Germans out. So, but let's go over this other area. So it must be 2 o'clock. Alright, so this is kind of sad. Well, the whole thing's sad. The names inscribed on these walls are soldiers whose bodies weren't found. So there are soldiers that were missing in action, presumed killed. And there's a whole bunch of them in here. And from these divisions, like in this area. And so the ones with the markers beside them were ones that were identified later, like with DNA, like later on. But at the time, they probably assumed that they would never find or figure out who the bodies were, but they did figure it out. So these 4, there's 2 there, and 1 down here. There's a 4th one somewhere. It's way up there. So they were identified later, like with DNA and different methods. And then he said that just a month ago, they identified a soldier who was buried in a regular cemetery around here. And then he was, they just had a ceremony in June or July, and he was buried here. But he's unidentified. They knew he was from the 2nd Division, and I think they knew the 2nd Division and the date. So I really don't know why it was just like until now that they figured that out. So he's unknown. They couldn't get DNA, I guess, to identify who he was. But they just buried him here. So there's still actually possibly people are going to be buried here if they identify remains later. And so, but so they also explain, like, there's like a hill here coming up this, we walked up this hill, and then behind here there's like a top of the hill, there's like a ridge, and then this was like one of the major battles were, because the Germans were on the other side of the ridge or whatever, and the Americans and, well, whoever, Americans, French, all the different divisions came up, and then they kind of met at the top of this hill. So this is where this was a battlefield right here where I'm standing. So, all right.